Thanks for the introduction. So how does a single 2D image, such as the one I'm showing you here, convey the 3D properties of a scene? This question is at the heart of any discipline involving perception, whether it's art, psychology, or computer vision. And in our field, this simple question has inspired 50 years of research. And in these years, researchers have proposed a wide variety of cues for perceiving 3D, as well as representations that can be perceived in 3D. But recent work has largely reduced this grand challenge of 3D scene understanding to one of two tasks. The first is recovering a category-specific reconstruction, where if I tell you that it's a bicycle, for instance, you can reconstruct the scene in terms of some sort of bicycle-specific model. And the same thing with cuboidograms. The other representation, which has become very popular, is a metric 2.5D reconstruction, where every single pixel, I can tell you something like the depth or the surface interval. And we believe that these approaches have dramatically improved our understanding of 3D, but we want to take a step back and we want to see if we're missing anything. So let's look at this object again. Well, if we look at it, I mean, in terms of a category, it's one of a kind. So we can't use a category-specific model. And even though you have some good sense of the shape, you don't have a very good sense of the absolute depth at every single pixel. But all of you know that irrespective of the depth, you know that the surface is extremely smooth, you know it's non-planar, you know that the object has a hole and it touches the ground in one location. And so the goal of this work is to infer 3D shape in these terms. And in particular, we want to map our input image to 3D shape attributes. And these are qualitative, higher order shape properties that are largely viewpoint independent. So for example, whether the object is primarily planar, whether it has a hole, does it touch the ground, is it made out of thin structures, and these sorts of things. And our idea of shape attributes comes from a long line of work in psychology and vision about the qualitative 3D shape of generic objects. So things like Biedermann's geons or Kundrin and Van Doren's shape categories. And so if we want to explore this idea of 3D shape attributes, we need a number of things. And the first thing we need is a set of 3D shape attributes. And so as initial dictionary, we've proposed 12 different 3D shape attributes, and these have been inspired by past work in computer vision and psychology. But this is by no means exhaustive. And 4 of them are based on curvature, basically how does a surface deform, so things like is it primarily planar. 2 are based on contact, like does it make multiple points of contact with the ground. And 6 are based on volumetric occupancy, like basically how does it occupy space. Is it composed of thin structures, does it have a hole? So this gives us our initial dictionary to play with. But we also need some data. And one option for using data would be to use ordinary Pascal VOC objects. But the problem with these ordinary objects is that there's very limited shape diversity. And even more importantly, there's a very strong correlation between the category as well as the underlying 3D shape. And so instead, we turn to modern sculpture, where there's a great amount of shape diversity and there really aren't any categories because these things tend to defy categorization. And in particular, we have a large data set of sculpture which has been captured off the internet, and each of these images of sculpture is labeled with our 12 3D shape attributes. So for example, these 3 objects in our data set all have planar surfaces, or primarily planar. These 2 are not. These 3 make point or line contact with the ground, and these 3 do not because they touch the bulk of their body. These 3 are made out of thin structures, and these 2 do not. And so as you can see, there's a great amount of diversity in the data in terms of the underlying 3D shape, as well as how these 3D shape attributes co-occur. But what's more important than also having just these images labeled is that they're also organized. And in particular, we have a hierarchy which we've extracted in a semi-automatic fashion from Wikipedia and Flickr using text processing. And at the first level of this hierarchy are artists. And the reason why it's very important to model artists is the following. Basically, if you look at artists, they tend to work in themes. So Alexander Calder, for instance, works a lot with sheet metal. And so all of his sculptures tend to be planar and have thin structures. And if we want to make sure that we're learning about 3D as opposed to Alexander Calder, we need to make sure that Alexander Calder only appears in either one of the train, the val, or the test set. And so we split the data set like this. The next level down is in terms of works of art. And so the goal of this work is to understand objects in a largely viewpoint-independent fashion, irrespective of material or location. So all 6 of these images, even though they appear in different locations, and some of them are made of different materials, are all considered to be the same work of art, because we're trying to model the underlying 3D shape. And so this gives us our hierarchy, and from there we can extract from the internet a large number of images, about 143,000, which are then further subdivided into what we call viewpoint clusters for better management of the data. And so this forms our final data set which we can work with. So the next thing we need to explore is a method. And what we're going to do is we're going to use, of course, convolutional neural networks. We're going to map the input image through a convolutional neural network, specifically the VGG-M network, which was pre-trained on ImageNet for classification. And we're going to ask it to predict two things. The first is the 12 shape attributes that we have labeled in the dataset. So for example, in this image, we should expect it to predict that this object has a hole and it touches the ground in one location. But we should also ask it to model the things that we haven't labeled. Because of course our dictionary is non-exhaustive. So we also ask it to produce a shape embedding. And the 12 shape attributes are modeled in a standard 12 independent binary classifications. And the shape embedding is done with a standard triplet loss, but because the triplet loss is less commonly known, we're going to explain it as well. And the idea of the triplet loss is you're going to map the input image to some sort of embedding space, or a high-dimensional vector space. And the goal is the following. If I give you one view of an object, for example this sculpture, and I give you a positive view, which is the same underlying 3D shape, but it might be a different viewpoint, might be a different location, and might be a different material. And then I have a negative view, and this is a totally different work of art. And the goal is to minimize the following loss function, which in terms of words means that you want to make sure that the anchor and the positive are close together in the feature space, and in particular closer than the anchor is to the negative and by a margin. So in other words, two views of the same sculpture ought to be close in this embedding space, or closer than two views of different sculptures. And then once we have this loss, we can backpropagate on both the attribute loss as well as the embedding loss to produce the final network, which serves as our final model for modeling these 3D shape attributes. So that gives us our method, and we have our data set. So now we can turn to the experiments. And the goals of our experiments are to answer the following three questions. The first is, how well does it do on these sculptures? Basically, how well are we doing? The second is to try to get additional confirmation that we're picking up on the actual 3D properties as opposed to something else in the background entirely. And finally, we want to make sure that it generalizes to more ordinary objects. So one way to do this is you can sort the test examples by how much they have each of these attributes. And you can see on the left, you have objects which most make point or line contact with the ground. And you can see on the right that you have objects which especially don't make point or line contact with the ground. Where you see on the right, this white sculpture is touching with the bulk of its body. So this gives us a way of assessing it qualitatively, but we also need to do it quantitatively. And so we also need some baselines. And the way the baselines are going to work is that in our method, we're directly mapping from the input image to these higher order properties. But another way you could do this is you could first estimate a 3D shape, or a Z, or a depth map. And then, using multiple different ways to estimate the Z, you can then go and map this depth map to a prediction of the 3D shape attributes. In other words, you have some sort of indirect method. And by combining different combinations for these two steps, you can produce a number of baselines. And the way we can assess performance is we use the area under the ROC curve, and then we can just evaluate how well we do. And we substantially outperform these indirect baselines overall in terms of the mean, as well as in each of these categories, in part because some of these properties are very difficult to extract from a depth map and very hard to estimate. So for example, rough surfaces. But the other thing we can do is we can ask which properties are easier to estimate for a CNN, for instance, and it turns out that properties that involve some sort of aggregation of a local judgment, like planarity, where you just have to look at each pixel and say whether it's planar or not, those our method tends to do especially well on. So this gives us sort of proof that we're able to pick up on these 3D properties in the sculptures, but we want some additional proof that we're really picking up on these 3D properties as opposed to something else. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to turn to the task of mental rotation, which is something from psychology. And the idea of mental rotation is that you have a pair of images, and you want to describe whether they depict the same object or not. And so the top is a positive, and the bottom is a negative. And here, roughness would be a useful property. And the idea is that we're going to use this mental rotation as a way of assessing whether the learned representation is actually picking up on these 3D properties. And specifically, we're going to just classify pairs of images using distances in a feature space, and we're going to use that as our sort of assessment of the feature space. And you should remember that artworks often appear at different locations and are made of different materials, so the background changes. And so the 3D shape remains the same. Now, if we take our full method, as I described, you should actually be pretty good at this task. because the shape embedding loss should force a representation to be good at this. But what we can also do is we can take the attribute loss itself and just use that to train the model. And we can see what happens to the feature space representation and how well it performs. And it turns out that compared to, our baseline is going to be the initialization. And compared to this initialization, we get a boost in terms of just by training with the attribute loss. And of course, if we train for basically for the mental rotation task, of course it does the best. But as an added bonus, we find that actually the 12-dimensional shape attributes themselves outperform IFV plus SIFT, which was until very recently a very strong method, which suggests that we're actually modeling these shapes. So that sort of provides additional confirmation, but finally we tested on more ordinary objects, and we can ask the same things. Like, for example, we can say that these biplanes are the most planar of planes in Pascal, and cylindrical steam engines are the least planar trains in Pascal. And we find similar results for many of the Pascal categories. So, in conclusion, today I've introduced the idea of 3D shape attributes, and these are qualitative higher order properties of shape, which are largely viewpoint independent. I've introduced a sculpture dataset, which we use to explore this idea of 3D shape attributes, and I've shown you a number of experiments. And these experiments have shown that we can predict these properties fairly reliably. We probably are picking up on these 3D properties themselves, and that they work on sort of more ordinary objects. And as I answer some questions, I'll leave you a video running of us on some synthetic images, which provides additional results for you to see.